Hi, everybody, and welcome to our final parallel session. Our parallel session today is DEI Fatigue impacting inclusive hiring in your organization. I am being joined today by Jamie Millar-Dixon and Kristin Bauer, and I look forward to. I'm going to leave it to you to introduce yourselves. I will let the people know who are joining us today that there will be time for Q&A at the end. We've built in some time for Q&A, so pop your questions into the Q&A box as they come up. And then once Kristin and Jamie are finished their presentations, we'll go back into a Q&A. So I leave it over to you. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I look forward to the presentation and, of course, the discussion after.
Welcome to the session we've developed for you on DEI fatigue. I'm Jamie Millar-Dixon, and I'm so pleased to be co-presenting with my dear friend and colleague, Kristin Bauer. Just please advance to the next slide. Yeah, so I'm an inclusive workforce consultant here in Vancouver, British Columbia, with BC Partners in Workforce Innovation. We're now in our 8th year, and what we do is recruit for employers. We recruit on behalf of employers who are intentional about workforce inclusion of people with disabilities. So we work with a number of employers here in the Lower Mainland, as well as some national employers. And we recruit on their behalf through a service partner network that helps support people with disabilities in their employment search. I'm also principal consultant of my own human resources consulting firm, MacLeod Silver HR Business Partners. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Kristin, to introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm delighted to be here today. So thank you for including me and for joining our session today. I am also in the Metro Vancouver area here in British Columbia. My name is Kristin Bauer, and I am a founding partner and diversity, equity, inclusion consultant with a boutique consulting firm here in Metro Vancouver called Leda HR. My consulting partner, Annika, and I both have over 20 years of HR experience under our belts. So we have worked in-house to improve employment opportunities and outcomes for people with disabilities, for increasing representation of Indigenous people, and really with the clients that we work with, where we're focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, we do everything to support them along their journey. And it could be from providing some training or learning opportunities to conducting equity, diversity, inclusion audits, which is a bit of a snapshot in time to see where an organization is at on their journey. And then we work to support them to build strategy or create programs that really are focused on how do we create the most inclusive workplace cultures where everyone feels that they can bring their unique skills and abilities and that they belong and are valued. We're going to take a moment just to take, we're going to take a moment to express our deep, heartfelt gratitude for the land upon which we live, work, and play. So for Jamie and I here in Metro Vancouver, this is the land of the Coast Salish people, and that is predominantly the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. We express our gratitude to Indigenous people, elders in particular, who have been the traditional custodians of this land.
Thanks, Kristin. Here's what we'll be covering with you over the next 40 minutes or so. I'm going to provide a context for our session, how this came to be. I'll talk about what is DEI fatigue and what are the contributing factors and signs, ways to address burnout, and then regaining momentum. If you see yourself in here somewhere, there's always an opportunity to hit a reset button as well. The context for today's session, we were originally going to deliver a different session, and we thought, no, there's some things that are happening here that we're noticing, and nobody was really talking about it. So what we were noticing was, and it's really started surfacing through the summer, was that the employers that we were working with who were really passionate about recruiting and retaining people with disabilities, we were starting to see those actions their actions and weren't supporting the commitments that were made. So we started having some conversations with some trusted folks in organizations and part of our networks as well, to try to get an understanding for what was happening. So that's just a little bit of a context for you. So we were asking about, how is DEI going in the organization, and what are you noticing as trends in the organization? Here's what we're noticing. What's contributing to that? So we'll share some of that with you today, and you may see yourself or your own organization reflected in what we're talking about. And it's, I think, a positive thing to discuss this. Next slide, please.
Thanks.
So
Kristin.
here, I think that when we see this, I think we know what this means. This is a pretty obvious visual, which is, really the last 3 years. I don't need to tell anybody who's in this session. It's been an incredibly disruptive time in the world, in our society, in community, and certainly in our workplaces. It's been a global pandemic, which has impacted everything, including how we deliver services and how we survive in business. Jamie, do you have audio yet? No. Okay. Next slide, please. And certainly a very significant moment in time, absolutely impacted the world, and certainly workplaces and those working in diversity, equity, and inclusion, was the really horrific murder of George Floyd. And that was back in May of 2020. So Black Lives Matter protests really prompted many organizations to either start or to redouble their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. It was a moment in time where you kind of had to choose a side in many aspects. Next slide, please. Yes, we can. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, thanks, Kristin, for jumping in on that. So yeah, this has had a real impact in our organizations, and it falls on the same people who are dealing with DEI to help organizations move through some of these new revelations and challenges and realities that they're dealing with internally. So we went from COVID and the challenges of COVID and having to look at working differently, and really that was a crisis point for us in our organizations, right? And then Black Lives Matter happened. So then the shift started to be, well, what are the race relations within our organizations now, and how are we dealing with this? And maybe some complaints started to come forward that people were starting to take light to. And then with Every Child Matters, that became a real focus on truth and reconciliation. There's a lot of challenges within organizations in terms of talking and dealing about this and recognizing their own truths internally. Next slide, please. Well, you can't go too far these days without seeing something like this, either plastered on a truck, a bus, a door, as you're a customer inside a store, right there on a checkout. Yeah, workforce shortages. So, they've been coming for years. We've heard about this for decades, and it's absolutely here now. So those workforce shortages are really challenging organizations. So on one hand, they may be committed to workforce inclusion with people with disabilities and hiring people with disabilities, but the volume of recruitment these days has really changed, especially in larger organizations. I work with one fairly large organization who traditionally would have 300 positions a month that they would be recruiting for. As of late spring this year, they're up to 800 a month, over 800 a month. Those are 800 openings that they're constantly trying to fill. Part of that is, obviously starting with 6-month contracts instead of permanent positions. They can't even fill the permanent ones. So what that means is, if you're the DEI lead in the organization, you're relying on the recruitment team to help support the activities to increase workforce representation of people with disabilities. But the recruiters are exhausted, right? So what are they going to do? They're going to take the shortest route to be able to find a person to get into that position, because the hiring manager has been without somebody in that role for a long period of time. So there's a lot of pressure on those teams. So while they're hiring, which is a good sign, the volume is it's too much for people to keep up with. So We've heard from the DEI leads that they're not pushing their recruiters as much. And in some organizations, we've noticed 100% turnover in the recruiters. They're just exhausted in this space right now. Okay, next slide, please. Are we feeling tense yet? I hope we're not stressing you out. Positive news, we've got some new legislation. We have new accessibility legislation here in British Columbia. And we also have the new Accessible Canada Act that was launched. And what do we have now? We've got BC, Manitoba, Ontario with provincial legislation. The federal legislation is now rolled out, and some of the new standards are being created and rolled out in the next couple of years to support the legislation, at least on a national level. Next slide, please. Oh, yes, yes. And now we're faced with, right, a recession, all the discussions around recessions. And guess what? Usually during recessions, there are layoffs, and that is also going to fall on the same group of people that are there within the organization to support inclusive hiring, because the hiring will go down, although it's not likely to, because we've got such high, we've got workforce shortages in many sectors across the country, but we're definitely in a tightened economy. And by the outlook, it's not going to get better for a little bit of time. So the recession, again, falls on the same people who are leading recruitment efforts for the organization. Next slide. Right. So one of the general managers of human resources who'd been with the company for almost 30 years, when we were talking about what's going on, she said, there are unprecedented competing priorities for human resources for our team. And that about sums it up. Unprecedented competing priorities. So something's got to give, right? When we're operating in that kind of a climate. So if we could just go back one slide for a quick second. I wanted to open it up for any sort of quick chats or discussions or observations. Is this sounding like this is something that you're encountering, or that your organization, others in your organization are encountering? And just, you can put a quick couple of comments in the chat if you like. Sounding familiar for you? RED? Red? Is it code red? Are we in code red now?
No, code red.
Okay. All right. Next slide, please. Okay, can't see. Thank you, Fran. Can't see Q&A because I'm in sharing slides. Thank you. We'll cover that off at the end then. We'll come back to that at the end. So yeah, these unprecedented competing priorities really are resulting in diversity fatigue. And this is not something new, although it's new to us in the degree that we're experiencing it right now and the reasons why we're experiencing it. But the history of this shows that it originated in the 90s. It was the stress experienced by companies and people in those organizations that were attempting to diversify their recruitment and retention practices. It's a change process, right? Going from the way it's always been done to having to adjust those practices to be more inclusive. And in 2020 onward, it's really reflecting feelings of frustration or isolation or demoralization, really frustration and fatigue of the DEI practitioners. And when we look at why we get into working in this area and why we contribute the level of passion in this space, this is often a personal connection to wanting to help organizations be more inclusive, wanting to ensure that nobody is left behind, that people can contribute in organizations, earn an income, contribute to society. There's a really high level commitment amongst DEI practitioners to work to inclusion and accessibility. And it really gets triggered when we don't see adequate results, right? Or when DEI is misused in an organization. Next slide, please. Who does it apply to? Human resources teams. They're tired. The DEI lead. It could be the hiring manager or a direct line manager or supervisor. There's a lot of pressure on those direct supervisors these days. Can apply to the ERGs or employee resource groups, service professionals. It can be, anybody who's deeply involved in this work. It can be affected by this. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Kristin, who's going to present you with some better news in terms of how to manage this in the workplace and how to even pay some attention to focus on self-care. Kristin.
Thanks, Jamie. Yes, somehow, and I say somehow, I didn't choose the slides, but Jamie did. So I get the more positive, proactive slides. So thanks, Jamie. I appreciate that. So if we can go to, thank you, contributing factors. So there's a lot that goes into the why we're feeling the fatigue. I mean, certainly there's just a lot going on in the world, and that's exhausting in itself. But a lot of times this work is done in silos. It's not connected to organizational goals or values. Frequently, there's a lack of resources. It is, and if you are an HR person or a DEI lead in an organization, I am willing to bet you have a very small budget, if you have a budget. And maybe most organizations, it's one person leading the work and accountable for it. There's a sense of urgency to achieve results. And if you've been doing this work for any length of time, you know that actually it's a long game. So it's not something that happens overnight. Minimal readiness training in organizations. So, there is groundwork and preparation and communication that needs to happen before you start to do the work, because it's so important that people understand the why and the how and the what that goes into DEI work. And, I've touched on this a little bit already, but if there's a disconnect between commitment, values, and operations, ties in with that working in silos or the minimal readiness. You really need to connect the dots. And this work cannot sit alone by itself on an island somewhere. It has to be connected to everything that goes on in an organization. Another one, which we have seen certainly because of all that's happened in the last few years with, some of the things that Jamie had mentioned, because there is more pressure on employers, because employees are starting to say, hey, you know what? I want to work for an organization that cares about stuff that's going on in the world. So organizations that focus just on the optics. So maybe it's, we did this one survey. Great. We did the check the box. We did a 1-day training on unconscious bias. Great. Unconscious bias is solved. Those small things versus really an acknowledgement that it is a long game and that real sustainable long-term systemic changes take time. And certainly a contributing factor is when organizations do a lot of the diversity talk, but they don't walk the walk. And Mercer's done some research around this as well. And because, as I mentioned, employees are starting to hold employers more accountable. They're watching for this. What's authentic and what isn't. Next slide, please. So the Globe and Mail, this is from September 21st this year, very recent. They said this: people are still excited about the possibilities, but they're frustrated by a lack of progress. So certainly, whether you're a DEI lead in your organization or an HR professional moving DEI forward, as I mentioned, many are feeling the pressure from adapting to, I'm going to use that word that we have heard repeatedly in the last few years, unprecedented competing priorities. Jamie just heard this from a CEO recently, as she mentioned. This is HR folks in particular are dealing with a lot of unprecedented competing priorities. And there's also that frustration that, I realize it's 2022. I feel like we should be further along. There has been progress, absolutely, towards workforce inclusion of people with disabilities in particular, but we still have a really long way to go. So let's talk a little bit about what are the signs. We'll move to the next slide, please. What are the signs of DEI fatigue to watch for in your team, your colleagues, and even employees, right? But also in yourself. So open statements of disillusionment, opting out or lack of interest. So these two points are very connected and very similar in that, you start to lose a little bit of like, oh, I just, I don't feel like I can do this anymore, or I just have too much on my plate right now. Whereas in the past, maybe when you were feeling a little bit more engaged and a little less burnt out and tired, you would have said, I got a lot on my plate right now, but I'm gonna make time for this because it's really important to me, it's important to my colleagues, and it's important to our organization. And again, this connects as well, lack of enthusiasm and participation. So when you start to see that, and this applies in particular to employee resource groups who are maybe, they're still working through their calendar of events and awareness or learning opportunities, and they start to see fewer people participating. There's some little signs to watch for if you really pay attention that you will notice. And these can be signposts or little, stop signs that say, wait a minute, this is something to pay attention to. And absolutely, a department within an organization, if you are an organization that's large enough to have an HR team, HR, oh my goodness, so much that HR has had to be really agile, have had to really pivot, have worked some really long hours. It's been a lot in the last 3 years. And so in particular, that is an area within an organization that is feeling a lot of fatigue. As Jamie mentioned, she's seen with some of her her clients that 100% turnover in some recruitment teams. I've seen it with some of my HR or the clients, HR departments within some of the clients that I work with. I checked in with one of my long-term clients back in the spring, and she said, oh my gosh, we're just, I'm recruiting for 3 positions. It's a 6-person HR team. So, 50% of her team was down. It can be a lot. Plus, you're trying to do all of this other stuff too. And then there's that compassion fatigue. And I think this is really important too. It's like, sometimes you feel like, and I have felt this too, and believe me, as a person who is so committed, this is life and work are pretty blended for me in terms of how I feel about society and community and workplaces and inclusion. You can start to feel a little bit of the compassion fatigue when you are constantly bombarded with stories from colleagues or employees. If you're a DEI person, you're hearing stuff from employees about marginalization or barriers or frustrations, or you turn the news on at night and you hear about missing and murdered Indigenous women, or people who are experiencing discrimination because of a disability and there's a lawsuit. There's a lot going on, and so sometimes you think, whoa, I don't feel anything right now. I just feel so tired from all of the stuff that's coming at me, which leads to burnout. So let's talk a little bit about burnout. We'll go to the next slide. Burnout is a term we hear a lot of. It's kind of like that word stressed. And I think that maybe popped up in the 80s or 90s. I'm so stressed out, or I feel so burnt out. Burnout is a real thing, so much so that the World Health Organization in 2019 classified it as, quote unquote, an occupational phenomenon. While this isn't actually a mental illness per se, it can absolutely lead to physical and mental illness. while healthcare workers have been on the front lines of the pandemic, and boy, I tip my hat to healthcare workers every single day. I think about the work that they do. HR professionals and DEI leads, those people have been on the front line within organizations, trying to keep organizations going and trying to support employees through, I'll use it again, through unprecedented times. Absolutely. But burnout and DEI fatigue don't actually need to happen. We can also work to reduce the impact on those experiencing it. And frankly, we must. If we care about psychological health and safety and mental health and physical health, we do have to prioritize this. We'll move to the next slide, please. So here are some tips that Jamie and I like. We think that are things to keep in mind that can help. You know, as I mentioned, it's a long game, right? DEI work and removing barriers in workplaces to full participation it's a long game. And, you know, if you're doing this work, you may have at times felt like this little girl. I know I have. Jamie, I'm sure you have as well, right? It's like, I'm going to put my head in my hands and just take a moment. And so I want to really say that it's important to recognize that this work is often hard. It's actually not supposed to be easy. If it was easy, we actually wouldn't need to do it, right? It would be done already. And as Jamie said, most of us doing it care a lot. And a lot of us doing it are representative of the communities that we're working to support. So, you know, we become frustrated or we can take it personally when we experience the challenges in moving the work forward. So here are some things to help put this into perspective. If you are experiencing DEI fatigue, it's real and it's okay to admit it. It's okay to admit it. It's okay to say, I feel really tired right now. You know, talk to a trusted colleague, talk to somebody who's also leading this work, maybe in another organization. You know, reach out to your manager, say, hey, can we just sort of talk a little bit about what I'm experiencing and how I'm feeling? You know, you don't have to come up with any solutions. Sometimes it's just really good and really healthy to talk about it. You're not alone. Absolutely not. A recent survey from WorkVivo found a staggering 98% of human resources professionals in the US have felt burnt out at work in the last 6 months. Remember, burnout, an occupational phenomenon. With almost 4 in 5, so about 78% of those people open to leaving their jobs. And again, we've seen it. We've seen it play out in human resources departments, recruitment teams, certainly across Canada with the clients that Jamie and I work with. The fourth point, so important, you're not a failure. You're a human being doing hard work. And sometimes, you know, if I'm feeling particularly frustrated, I will say to myself, wait a minute, why do you do this work? And it's because if I can help even one person, then that for me is success. So, you know, put it into perspective. You're not a failure. It's hard work and you are creating an impact. Even if it's only 1 or 2 or 3 or 20 people right now, you are creating an impact. And as the old saying goes, learn to rest, not quit. So let's all take a breath. Remember why we do this work. And now let's keep going. So next slide, let's talk about how we can regain momentum. I mentioned this already. You know, the why, the what, and the how are essential. And, you know, if we're at a place, whether in an organization or you just feel it personally, that you think I've hit that wall, I've got the burnout, or I see that my colleagues or the employees in our organization are feeling the burnout, it's okay to pause. Take that time to communicate the why, the what, and how, because actually, just like every negative thing has a positive side to it, there's an opportunity here. And that opportunity is to actually reaffirm your commitment reaffirm individual commitment to DEI, reaffirm your organization's commitment to DEI, because that actually sends a really important message to your employees that you're in it for the long haul, and that when the going gets tough, you're going to keep going. And that can help employees to be, to be able to take that breath as well and to say, okay, yeah, this isn't just a flash in the pan. It's not just because of one thing. This is actually who we are as an organization. Develop a plan that aligns with your organization's strategy and integrate DEI initiatives into your everyday work. It almost never works if it's not connected to your values, your vision, integrated into everything that an organization does. Because if you don't, employees and leaders will just view it as that thing that HR is doing, or that thing that one person that's passionate about inclusion does. Organizations that are inclusive of diversity are far more successful, both from an employee engagement standpoint and from a financial bottom line standpoint. And whether you are a not-for-profit or a for-profit organization, you need to have a good financial bottom line to be able to reinvest in your organization. Create some achievable short-term goals. This is a really important one because it is a long game. You also want to really identify what is actually the low-hanging fruit. What are some things that we can do in the short term that will counter that feeling of, oh, we're not achieving anything. Be proactive, not reactive. This one, is really talking about all of the different issues that are coming at us in the news and in society about things that are happening in the world. And if you're always in a position of, oh, I have to react to this as an employer or as an organization because our employees require it now, or our clients and customers require it or expect it, you're always going to be a step behind. So be proactive, identify what are the issues that are really strongly connected to our organization. I have a client that I work with that created an employee resource group right after the death of George Floyd as a result of that. And since then, they've put a lot of initiatives in place. And one of those things is something that they call guardrails. And so they have basically a list of criteria that is in alignment with their organization's values, as well as their diversity and inclusion initiatives. And so they know now if things come up, if there's a tragedy that happens in the world, they know how they're going to respond and to what they're going to respond, because you also can't be everything to everyone. The next point I think is really also very important, which is collect and analyze data. Data can be your friend. And I say that as a person who spent 2 years in grade 9 math. So numbers are not my forte. But when you have numbers to support anecdotal feedback, you can really tell an important story. And that story can help you to get leaders on board and help you get employees on board, and can also identify what's working within your DEI efforts and what isn't. Make it a team effort. So again, I can't say this enough. This should not be an initiative that just sits on the side of someone's desk in HR. You have to connect leaders throughout the organization, employees throughout the organization, HR, your DEI lead if you have one. Everybody should be part of this team to make this come to life. And build a community. So if you are the person who's accountable for this within your organization, connect with people doing this work outside of your organization. Certainly within your industry is great because you can talk about some of the same challenges you're facing, but also, look to build connections and relationships with people doing this work in different industries, because that's actually a great way to mitigate unconscious bias. Any bias that you may have about how things should be done in your industry, you can hear different perspectives from people doing this work in other organizations. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a big one. We know through lots of research that pretty much as soon as the pandemic started, rates of mental illness in Canada began to skyrocket. Depression, anxiety, and addiction issues increased significantly. And certainly, mental disorders are also classified as disabilities. So it's really important when we consider and reflect on everything that Jamie mentioned about sort of the state of the nation, so to speak, the state of the world, state of workplaces, the work that we're doing, which is hard, of course, but also really incredibly challenging and rewarding in the best possible ways. All of this can take a toll on us. I know for myself, the last month or so in particular, after a really busy fall of work, I'm feeling really tired, really tired. And so it's important, again, to really focus on your self-care. And I don't mean, a bubble bath, although that can be a great part of your self-care. But, Jamie and I really want to share this message with you, which is that, taking care of yourself and having an employer that cares about your well-being is not a luxury. It's actually a necessity. Use your vacation time. Take your breaks. Exercise. Eat well. And build your support network and community. This will go a long way in helping you navigate those times when you do feel exhausted. When you feel like you can't go on, right? Take a break, learn to rest, not quit. And as Jamie has said, put on your own oxygen mask first. Really, really important. So focus on the long-term goals and celebrate your short-term wins. This is important work and it's hard, but you can do it. And I know you're already doing a great job of it. So we wanted to pause now and ask if there are any questions, or, if there's anything that you'd like to share about what's a challenge you've faced, or what's worked for you in navigating DEI fatigue. And we're going to pause now and pass it back over to Maureen to facilitate some discussion.